final installment will explore the idea of cancel culture and how it does and doesn't involve fundamental.
Hi, what's up? That's my name. Don't wear it out. Ha 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 ha. It's going great. Okay. I was on my phone. I was too lazy to text you, so I thought like the easiest way to get you to shut the fuck up was to say, "Oh, do you want to talk tomorrow?" So that you would stop DMing me. So here we are. Gotcha. Good choice. Absolutely. Yep. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Okay. Well, best way is going to be with relation to whatever your goal is. I guess. What is your goal? What do you want to do? What do you want to get out of it? Then you should just post pictures and give hot takes on current events, right? That should be the. I mean, if that's right, I think current events are the big thing, and then funnel money into your whatever you make the most money off of. I'm guessing it's OnlyFans. I don't know how much your stream makes, but
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like one interesting thing was that like talking to you and the few times that I did, I made like ridiculous amounts off of that. Like I think I made like $4,000 in
Good,
excess
nice.
income. Like the
You're gonna
first time
cut
that
me
I
in on
talked to
some of
you.
that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, of course. It's only fair. But like,
Okay, why don't you should publish that? Look at how not transphobic my audience is. See?
yeah, exactly. Your audience, they
Exactly.
love cooming to
True,
trans women.
exactly.
It's
Exactly.
incredibly progressive. But at the same time, that made me like suddenly like, oh shit, like I don't want to like ask Destiny to talk about things because that's like me like clout chasing or whatever. And I don't want to like be seen as that. So
Interesting phenomenon with that. I say this every time somebody brings it up. Usually, the people that are most worried about being clout chasers are usually the people that you would want clout chasing the most. Like, there are a few people that I've talked to that I don't talk to as much as I would because they're worried about how it comes off. But I don't usually mind. Like, if you clout chase something, that's fine. You seem like a cool person. I don't care. But then other people that I don't like will hardcore clout chase, and I'd rather just not talk to them at all. So,
that's interesting. Yeah, I mean like there's there's also this sort of like thing that I'm learning to navigate, which is just generally like the authenticity piece and try not to like suck up to people because it's very easy to like suck up to if I wanted to like suck up to your audience and just like make DGG like me and that would like bring me income.
Yeah.
But I think it's like it's not a sustainable strategy to do that. So I think that I've been trying to like maybe navigate the space in a little bit more of an authentic way.
I mean, yeah. At the end of the day, it's all going to depend on what your goal is. If it really is truly, I mean, you made incompatible statements. You said that like earlier, your goal is to just make money, but clearly that's not the only goal, or there must be some other value that supersedes that at least a little bit, given your current income. Because you said if you wanted to, you could just like, do a bunch of dumb shit, like be a socialist and LARP is that what you're, but you don't. So there must be something else that you value a little bit more than that, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just like it's very hard to do that. It's very hard to take on a position because convincingly that you don't have over the long term. And I'm like very easily drawn into political debates just because I love arguing with people and fighting with people over things, even though I don't think that that's necessarily always a good way to exist in life. I mean, one thing that I've really had to work on with just like personal relationships is not debating people, and just trying to be like less of a debate lord in my own personal relationships.
For sure.
And I think that's like one of these examples where you have these competing values, and you sort of have to balance them off of each other.
Yeah, I mean, that's an issue that I have sometimes. Is that it's tempting, especially in relationships, like debating people over their feelings, or accusing somebody of being irrational or something is dumb. Yeah. Have you how is the? I haven't done like I was gonna do a night where I was just gonna go through all the numbers and see post ban how the Twitch politics scene is doing. How do you think everybody's doing? Is everything still going okay, or is it kind of falling apart, or what's going on?
I think it's going all right.
Mm-hmm.
I had this debate with Vosh the other day, and I don't know, Vosh is like very willing to talk to me and debate with me, which I think is interesting. And I'm not I think I can be like a very conciliatory person, or like my rhetorical strategy is oftentimes to just like talk to someone and get them to the point where they're making concessions to me, with the goal of just having it so their audience ultimately is like, okay, here's this person who is identifying as like moderate right wing, or I would maybe even consider a conservative, and they're making points, and Vosh is sort of agreeing with them and giving ground. And I think that's like a good way to open up sort of doors, but it's hard too, because I think that's not always like the best content. Like I was talking to Mr. Grout Max, and he was saying something like, I think if I were to have you on a show, you would just like, we would agree on too much and it wouldn't make for very good or interesting content. And I think that's definitely true to an extent, because like the Twitch sphere really selects for like this sort of disagreement, and political
Entertaining
violence.
disagreement, right?
Right, exactly. So like you can be successful on Twitch as like a sort of a heel for big streamers, just
Kind
like
of,
this
yeah.
lol cow. And
Although you have to be willing to do it. Everybody likes the idea of that, but it's really hard to do that in the long term because it will destroy people's like mentals. Like people can't handle that kind of conflict long term, even if they think they can.
yeah, that's also another thing that I've realized. Like it's a lot of people who look in from the outside sort of have this assumption that like, oh, well, I would be different. Like if I'm talking to them or I'm getting like hate, like I would just ignore it or whatever. And that's very hard to do. That's like definitely a skill you have to develop over time.
For sure.
Can I run my Vosh debate or like by you and ask what
This
your
is
thoughts
your
are on it?
time on my stream. You can do whatever you want,
Incredible.
okay?
I'm
Go
just
for
gonna
it.
commandeer your stream. It's my
Go for
stream
it.
now.
Yep. Oh, wait, actually.
Yeah.
Introduce yourself. I'm going to go put food in the oven. 1 sec.
Okay. Is he gone, DGG? You get to break all of the rules now. Say it. Say it, guys. I don't know what to say. Obama. There you go. You're welcome. Yeah, I guess you guys probably don't know too much about me. My name is Taff, or Taftaj, or April. I post cringe on the internet all the time. That's my professional job. It's just posting cringe. Listen, I'm morbing all the time, okay? I have seen Morbius. You know what, Morbius? Far better movie than Everything Everywhere All at Once. I barely even know the name of the second movie, because I've spent too much time morbing. Yeah, I cried watching Morbius. And then I watched Everything Everywhere All at the same time, and my tears turned to the desert. They were sucked back into me. It was so bad. I can't believe Destiny's getting food. Ooh, boring. You should just drink Soylent. Eating? What a loser. I would simply not have to eat. I'm just built different that way. Eating? No. Fucking lame. But yeah, I feel awkward sometimes talking to Steven. Because, like, what the fuck do I say to him? He, like, asked me to talk, and I was like, sure. But I sort of want to talk to him about politics and just, like, debate him on shit. I think that would be fun. The thing is that, like, talking to Steven, he... Is there a Duke Nukem? Am I talking over dono sounds? The thing is that, like, talking to Steven, Half-touch. Notice how he dominated you in status by telling you to talk. Yeah, Steven was just like, all right, I'm gone. I'm just going to force Half-touch, the most interesting person on the internet, to fill stream volume. Because clearly she's the most entertaining person here. Status? How the fuck do you say it? More complicated than saying my name, for sure. I consider myself right-wing. I'm trying to do like a manifesto type thing explaining my political positions because I think that they're difficult for people to understand. A lot of people think that I'm libertarian, and I haven't identified as a libertarian since like high school. But yeah, I think like the libertarian goal of sort of spontaneous order is something that's desirable, but not something that can be just achieved on its own. You need like very specific conditions to achieve that, and ideally you want to create those conditions politically. So like one thing that I would do, if you go like to the suburbs of a city, you'll notice that there's not a lot of police in the suburbs. And it's not because like you'll also notice that there's like not a lot of crime. And it's not because like less police equals less crime. In fact, the opposite is true. But rather that like the socioeconomic conditions in the suburbs are such that there aren't a lot of incentives to commit crime. And so like that status, that goal, that scenario or environment where you don't need a lot of police is desirable, where you can let up on state influence. That relaxing of state power is desirable, but it's something you have to work to. And so I think that like the libertarian status of, loosening government and allowing people to engage in free association.
Fuck, hold on. I'm so sorry. Stop, you guys are being so rude. Hold on. I didn't pause my donuts when I left, and Duke Nukem he gets a little bit crazy sometimes.
Oh yeah, chat was yelling at me at different times, but I talked over Duke Nukem. So that's the status game.
Okay. Hold on 1 second. Chill, 1 second. Okay, I got it. 14 kids dead. That's old news. It was linked 20 minutes ago in chat, guys. All right? The bodies are cold. Chill. All right, anyway.
We have important things to discuss, like the status of my OnlyFans career.
Yeah, okay.
Did you catch the Vosh debate with What a Faultist?
No, I wanted to watch it, but it wasn't linked to me. Wait, what were you talking about? Okay, our brains are reset.
Yeah, this is gonna lead into it, but like,
okay, I did not. I wanted to, but I haven't seen it. No.
Yeah, it was an absolute dumpster fire. They both just like talked over each other and nothing happened. But like,
Based.
I don't know if you're familiar with what Altist as a creator. He creates these kind of like alternate history videos, which if you dislike my history takes, I think you will be infinitely more annoyed by what Altist's history takes. Because he has this tendency to like select one or two historical facts and like extrapolate the fuck out of them.
Okay.
So
Wait, did you really say Everything Everywhere All at Once was a bad movie?
compared to Morbius, it may as well be a 1 out of 10, Stephen.
Okay, good roll. Okay, sorry. So he extrapolates alternative history things.
Or just like, individual historical facts. And so like this debate got brought up within the discussion between him and Vosh about the ideological origins of the modern social justice movement. And what he was saying is that like modern social justice has much more leftist ideological origins than the civil rights movement. And they sort of just talked over each other and, nothing happened. And I think that What If Altist gave a pretty weak version of this argument. But there is a stronger version of the argument. And that's what I ended up debating Vosh about, as well as like worker productivity and some other things. But I think it's important to draw distinctions between modern social justice and the civil rights movement, because a lot of times they're quite different in their approach to solving societal issues. And I think it does make sense for someone to like be supportive of aspects of the civil rights movement, but not a fan of the modern social justice movement.
Okay. Well, do you want to give that argument to me or
Elaborate.
what?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think like the bad way to make this argument is to say that they're completely different. There's no overlap, and like, night and day, you can like one and not like the other one. But the better way to make this argument is to point out that there were radical leftist aspects of the civil rights movement, and there were liberal and perhaps radical liberal aspects of the civil rights movement. And both of these wings of the civil rights movement competed for influence. But the government of the 1960s and the American public opinion of the 1960s was not one of radical leftism. And so the civil rights movement wing that ultimately won out and won the affection of the public and is sort of remembered favorably by people is the wing that is the more liberal one. It's the one that made arguments on the basis of, I am a man, and, all men are created equal, and therefore I ought to have, affirmation of my rights as an equal person, established in law. And so the civil rights movement is really a codification of that liberal principle of equality, despite the fact that there were genuinely very radical leftist movements at the time advocating for civil rights. And so I think that you can point that out. And I think Vosh will point to the radical elements and say, like, yes, there were radical elements. That's true. But I would say that, like, the reason why the civil rights movement was initially successful and the way that a lot of people remember it is because of its successful appeal to, like, these liberal principles. And then you fast forward in time to now, and modern social justice is a relatively fringe, movement. It doesn't represent all of the left, but it represents maybe 6% of the very progressive people, people who are like Ibram X. Kendi or Kimberly Crenshaw, who make these like very radical arguments for social justice that are rooted in Marxist arguments. And so I think that you can legitimately, as a liberal person, look at those Marxist arguments and say, those aren't so good, and we can disavow those, but I still agree with the founding principle of the civil rights movement.
Okay.
So
I don't know if I would necessarily disagree, or I don't think I even have strong feelings on this, or I don't know how relevant I would consider this to any of the arguments that I make, but okay, I understand what you're saying.
yeah, I don't even think it's like that controversial of a take, but I just ended up going in circles over and over with Vosh on like whether or not this was true. And it sort of culminated with Vosh saying that, well, ideas that were once radical are now considered sort of mundane. And so ideas that are like radical now would be like very radical in the past. And that sort of felt like, okay, now he's conceding ground to me, but he's still saying that like he disagrees with me. And the discussion just sort of fizzled with like me not being able to pin him down on any sort of topic or any sort of position.
Sure. I'd have to watch the conversation or watch Lubin because I mean it could have been your fault, right? I don't know. I'd have to watch it.
Well, I
Right?
think
But
it was sort of my fault because, like,
okay.
I have a hard time sort of engaging rhetorically sometimes. And I do think that I made rhetorical blunders where, like, I used radical and leftist interchangeably. And this is probably like a bad move on my part because, like, the liberal arguments were radical at the time. And I should have, like, specified that when I was saying radical, what I was really trying to express was like leftist or Marxist. So I think we sort of ended up getting in the weeds there, where like we were just speaking past each other because I was using a word in one way and he was interpreting it in another way. So yeah, ended up kind of going back and forth in circles.
Gotcha. How often is it pretty easy for you to get into contact with Vosh? Like, will he just talk to you no matter what, or?
I think so. I think Vosh likes talking to me. Yeah, I like messaged him and I was like, thanks for talking. And he was like, yeah, I like talking to you. So
Nice. Good job.
yeah, but he doesn't talk to you.
No.
Why is that?
We all have our versions why, but you can ask him that. I think his answer is that I'm a bad faith interlocutor. There's no reason to talk to somebody like me because all I'm going to do is obfuscate with logical fallacies, and I'm never going to approach anything in good faith.
I guess.
What are you going to do, man? When you're bad faith, you just can't help but be bad faith.
I mean, I don't know. I think that's quite a shame that he won't talk with you because I think it's entertaining. And
yeah, it's super entertaining for all the audiences involved, really. The issue is that just the last few conversations we had, he looked really bad. And I think he's a little bit more obsessed with making like optically salient points rather than things that like are rationally or logically true. And as long as he's on that bridge and I'm on the other one, if I'm being at least a little bit mindful, the conversations are always going to make him look really silly. And I think we ran into 2 or 3 in a row of those where that happened. So I think for him, it's just, there's like nothing to be gained from talking to me. Like the increase in viewership or whatever isn't worth the optical hits of like actually taking an optical loss to Destiny to debate, which is like pretty bad. Nobody wants to be that person.
well, it also seems that he's like really hyped you up as just like incredibly incompetent. And
Yeah, he does it a
like
lot, but the
awful.
issue is that like those none of those arguments ever logically follow, right? Like imagine if you knew there was an incompetent person with a larger fan base than yours who was willing to debate, like you would do that every time, right?
Unless you thought that they were just like Weasley and
Nah, I'd
like
still
really
no way. If
good.
they're bigger than me, if I thought that Crowder or Shapiro or Jordan Peters, like you do those debates 10 out of 10 times, always, because it's just there's like the exposure is huge, the potential to gain a new fan base is huge, the viewership on your videos will be huge, like the dunk video, like everything's just like it's such a no brainer, right? The only reason you would do it is because you're afraid of the other person, or if they're like legitimately like a far smaller content creator than you or something, because otherwise, why would you avoid it? It's such a great opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, kind of. But like from his perspective, it's going to be that arguing with you is like he would basically say the same thing about you that you say about him. He would say that like you're just like Weasley and like optically focused and
Yeah,
you're
but the
not really
difference
interested in
is
having a real conversation.
Yeah, but the difference is I don't run from that. That's an opportunity for me. I know that Vosh is dumber and more optically obsessed. So like that's free views for me. I can grab parts of his fan base. I get emails from ex-fans of his. I think I look good in most of those conversations now. Like, yeah, that's the difference. We might say the same things about each other, but at the end of the day, I'm willing to put up and he kind of wants to have the fortress arc. So I think that speaks to the difference in the conviction of our arguments.
Do you think that, I mean, like, what is your perspective on, because he's very willing to talk to me. And I wonder if part of that is like my rhetorical style being like very non-aggressive. But I don't
Yeah,
know.
as long
Why
as
do
he
you think
feels
that
like he
is?
gets to kind of like walk away with like his honor and dignity intact and just sort of change his position on anything, I think he'll be willing to talk to most people in that realm.
It's like
that, yeah.
a face saving thing, right?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny that you were watching like that status video because it's so connected to all of this. A lot of times, like negotiating with people or interacting with them is just this face saving game where you're trying to allow them to preserve their dignity. And if you destroy them, they're not going to be willing to have continued conversations with you.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
What's your take on like, I don't know, what's the current drama with Max and Brittany? Because I feel like I haven't followed that Totally.
I'll reiterate it again for the 7 millionth time, even though I don't know if my fan base understands this or agrees or anything, but I like interesting people. I think that the new cast of characters I have on my stream are incredibly interesting. I think Max is very interesting. People hated Brittany for a long time because she sounds a little woo-woo. Now people are hating Max a bit because he sounds a little abusive. And there's a lot of crazy wild stuff going on. Max just did a video recently, and I think my community is kind of against him on that, and then we're just kind of bouncing around on figuring out who we hate more in my community. But
sounds like good drama. I don't know, I found Max sort of annoying at first, and then I think he grew on me quite a bit. I do think that there's like a lot of value in people who are willing to take tough positions. Like you asked me one time when you were still doing like a trans section of your manifesto. I don't know if that's gonna eventually make it to the final cut.
Yeah, it is. But go ahead.
Okay, yeah. I mean, you asked me about autogynephilia, AGP.
Oh yeah, careful.
Yeah. Well, I think that like how Max sometimes talks about his experiences with abuse or with pedophilia or with like, just his sexual interactions. It reminds me a lot of what I've tried to do talking about autogynephilia and being like very open about my experiences with AGP in a way that is enormously taboo in the trans community.
That is true. Hold that thought for 1 second. My oven just beeped. 1 second.
Wow, going to get food once again. Disgusting. Yeah, AGP. I'll talk about that with Steven. I already said Obama, but I'll say it again. Obama. Okay, AGP for like the audience. It's autogynephilia, which is self-arousal when you view yourself as a woman. And so it sort of implies that there's like a sexual component to being trans and to transitioning, which I think is true, at least for me. And I think it's something that's like, it's very stigmatized and very poorly understood. And so one thing that I try to do when I talk to people is just like own that sort of hard characterization, and then try to force people to actually engage with what that experience is like and whether or not that experience is something that's morally wrong or should actually affect how people see me. I don't think that cis women can have AGP in like the traditional Blanchard sense of the term, but cis women can experience like the same feeling of like self-arousal.
What are they feeling? I get self-aroused all the time. What are you talking about?
Bro, based. Hell yeah. Welcome to the AGP gang.
I feel like AGP is a really difficult feeling to wrestle with because I don't know where the AGP, how you feel you might have AGP versus you're just like a normal like human being. Like to some extent, I've talked to a lot of girls that are like, I really like having sex with mirrors so that I can like see myself and shit. Like that's like a normal cis woman, normal probably a lot of person experience. But I can imagine, especially depending on the trans communities you've been in, it's got to be like some huge fucking fear if you're like a newer Zoomer trans kid, like, oh God, I can never be aroused by my own body. Otherwise, I'm one of those AGP fucking freaks and I'm like not even a real trans. Like, that's got to be like a really mind-fucky scenario to be in, I would imagine.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And like throw in the additional factor, which is you're part of this marginalized group and you're trying to advocate for your gender's legitimacy. And if there's any sort of whiff that your gender identity might be the result of just like sexual impulse or fetish, that's something that a lot of people feel like delegitimizes their sort of claim to gender identity. So that makes it much harder as well.
Which is difficult though, because I mean, like, being sexual and everything is kind of like it's a pretty big fucking part of our gender and our expression and everything, right? Like sex and all of that is a pretty big part of what we do. So it's kind of weird that you are almost like forced to disassociate that from your identity in order to not be offensive or in order to validate your own gender identity or something. It's kind of weird, but.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Because a lot of people experience like something similar to it. I had like a talk with a bunch of cis women, And afterwards, for some reason in the group chat, AGP got discussed. And a lot of the cis women were saying things that like they experienced, experiences that would be labeled as AGP if they were cis women, to greater extents than even I would say that I experience.
If they were, wait, you mean if they were trans women?
If they were trans women. And that's like an important thing to understand too, is like autogynephilia is unique in that it's not like arousal at just like your current body state, but it's arousal at like imagining it as a way that's like different than it would naturally be. So like for a trans woman to like be aroused by the idea of being a woman, it'd be like more comparable to like a cis woman being aroused by the idea of being a man. And that would actually be like quite unusual. And so it's not unusual necessarily for like,
yeah, it would, but like it's like 12 times more complicated because like am I a real trans person, or because if a trans woman thought of her body in a sexual way as a woman, is she thinking of herself as a different sex, or is the sex is in her brain, right? How do you like if you don't even know you're trans, because especially puberty, like people might be questioning, like that's got to be a really difficult thing to sort through,
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. Because if like the brains of trans women truly are such that they are just like identical in some like biological way with cis women, or similar enough that you'd have like the same mechanism occurring where you might have self-arousal, but that self-arousal is like targeted towards an internal gender identity as opposed to an external sex. It would make sense for them to have experiences of AGP, and it would in fact be like totally in line with the rest of the population. But see, like having this conversation with you, we've already drilled down deeper and more meaningfully on the topic than like you can usually, because people are just too afraid to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, like try having a discussion with Demon Mama about autogynephilia.
Nope, that's a one-way ticket to Transphobiasville. Yeah. Wait, have you talked? Did you mention? I don't know, because I didn't listen because I walked away. Did you tell everybody like the history of AGP and like why it's so theoretically problematic to talk about it? Or
I was talking about it a little bit. I gave like a very brief definition, which is that it's like self-arousal, the idea of imagining yourself as a woman. It was developed by a sex researcher named Ray Blanchard, and he basically had this typology of like, he argued that people who transition, they do it for gender dysphoria reasons, but there's also a sexual component, and that can include AGP. And a lot of his studies were like not conducted in the best way. A lot of the evidence wasn't like super strong. And so when people critique AGP, a lot of times what they critique is like the strength of those studies. And they'll be like, well, they're not very strong, so like we can just dismiss all of it. And it's convenient to dismiss all of it because it's like it's a very hard topic to talk about. But I think it's true to the experience of a lot of trans women.
Yeah, but then I've seen people tell me that the way that I see it expressed the most, and kind of like the trans communities that are very much against that idea, is that it basically takes transness and like reduces it to a very like fetishy kind of sexual kink kind of thing, basically. And that was the issue that people had with the Blanchard guy, because my understanding is that, and I might be misunderstanding this, doesn't he basically say that like trans women come from either like, was it like gay men in denial or something, or the autogynephilia thing? I think these were like the two types of trans women that he identifies. So people who are trans feel like this guy is basically reducing our trans experience to like these weird sexual kinks.
Yeah, exactly. The other typology, the other group is homosexual transsexual. And he argues that like there's some set of like very feminine gay men, and Ray Blanchard, he's a gay man. He argues that there's some set of very feminine gay men who have a lot of pressure around them environmentally to transition and just live as like women so they can date men. And so like historically speaking, like there's some instances where like this might make sense. So like, people talk about like Iran and like forced gender transitions because of like their unique historical circumstance where like the Shah of Iran like interacted with a trans person and became like, preferred people transitioning to being gay. And that's like a very unique historical circumstance. But you see like echoes of that elsewhere where, someone might be trans or it might be homosexual, but it's easier just because they're already so feminine to transition and then pass as like a woman and date men that way. I don't know. I think that like of the typology, I believe in AGP more than HSTS. I think HSTS sounds like a very unique set of circumstances for someone.
Yeah, it's not going to be like just because there's like so much going on with being trans. The idea that somebody would go through all of the effort to transition and do all of this just to have like weird trans gay sex it seems a little bit extraordinary.
It's a little far-fetched, right?
Yeah, or it's a lot of effort, right?
I think so, but that's also the criticism of AGP is that like, you know, being trans requires so much effort and so much suffering that if it was just for something that like, you know, you could masturbate and then like feel like alleviation from, you probably wouldn't do it. And so I think that like Ray Blanchard, he's acknowledged that like trans women, even if they are AGP, do have gender dysphoria. And he thinks that like transition is still the right move, medically speaking, for trans women to do, even if they're AGP. And so like, funnily, he'll get invited to like TERF discussions and then he'll end up arguing with them because they're like, yeah, these AGPs, they're crazy, right? And he's like, yeah, they're crazy. And they're like, that's why trans women shouldn't exist. And he's like, well, actually, like HRT is probably good for them. And it's like, you know, our best known solution to gender dysphoria.
Okay, well, anything else?
No, that's all. We've exhausted every conversation, I think.
Every single topic. What do you how's the political streaming and everything going then?
I think it's fun. I haven't done it enough. I sort of want to do it more, but I think it's harder when like you don't have a lot of like viewers or, you know, people, because like I'm very interested in having conversations with people, but it's sort of boring, I think, to just like talk to my own stream.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. If you don't have like a lot of viewers or a diversity of thought in the audience, it's just kind of you arguing with one chatter or something over and over again, right?
Right, exactly. Sometimes I have the impulse to just like, I don't know, like at random people who I see like mentioning me, being like, oh, that's just a dumb fuck. And they have like some terrible interpretation of my opinion. And I'm like, you need to argue with me. But
do you ever pick fights with people on Twitter? That's how I get a lot of my content.
Maybe I should. I think that what I want to do with Twitter is like make it a little bit less NSFW. And then
oh yeah, shit. You should just make another Twitter account for that. People get super ass mad when there's like not safe for work shit on their Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like what I'll probably transition to is just having like sort of sexy like lingerie pictures on Twitter, but nothing that shows like genitalia. That would be my goal.
Could you not just make like another like Taftage politics Twitter or something, or?
I could, but like ultimately, like the goal is like funnel people to OnlyFans.
Well, then you link off to your other account with it, right? Like this is my not safe for work account.
It's an option. I could definitely try it. Yeah. I think the other thing is that like sometimes people have the interest in like debating me or having discussions with me just because the idea that someone with like a relatively large NSFW Twitter following would even like engage in these topics at all is sort of novel and interesting.
Sure. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I think that's probably how I got you. I was like, Steven, I've got this big Twitter. You should debate me.
No, I'm just a chaser. That's the only reason I.
Oh, okay, that's the reason. It explains your transphobia because you only see us as objects.
Yeah, and I'm kind of like grossed out by my own desires and stuff. So I'm like,
yeah, exactly.
Like I figure if I hate you guys enough, it'll like.
You desperately want to fuck
there. I meant guys in the actual misgendering way, not guys in the gendered way. Yeah, if I misgender all of you guys, it makes me feel better about my own desires and everything. So
yeah, Keffels ratios you, and you come instantly.
Basically, yeah. She doesn't realize that she's actually ratioed me across like 13 different accounts. I make a new account and I get ratioed by her constantly. She doesn't even know what she's doing for me. But
in fact, she's only ratioing you.
Maybe, possibly, you know. Yeah.
It was just all Steven the entire time.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah, that seems plausible. Okay.
All right. Well, hey, have fun. Be careful. If there's anything that comes up, you can always shoot me a DM and we can chat about it. Okay.
Yeah. Hopefully, I'll watch your stuff and find something to yell at you about.
Gotcha. Sounds good.
Yeah. Bye, Steven.
Have fun. Bye.
He's fun. Dogs. Talking to talking to Destiny is so weird. I don't know why. I did not get banned for linking to my Twitter. It's still accessible. I got banned for doing like a bikini stream. No, I'm looking at you guys now. Bro, I don't know, talking to Steven is just so weird. Cause like, no, it's not perma. I just didn't Twitch stream today because I was talking to Destiny and he's banned there. Why is Destiny banned? I think Destiny got banned during the trans sports discourse. Okay, here's what's weird about talking to Destiny is because like I message him randomly on Discord. And when I message someone on Discord, like I don't expect them to respond necessarily. Because I just like I will be like annoying, but like I don't care necessarily if they respond. I obviously like it's nice when you get a response, but like I'm okay with just like sending people 2 messages in a row or whatever. And so I messaged Destiny on Discord. And then he responded and he was like, yeah, we can talk about things. But then when we called, he was like, yeah, I called you so you'd shut the fuck up. So I'm like, okay. Who do you think represented liberal values? So I think what you have to understand is that it's not like black and white with the civil rights movement. It's not that like Martin Luther King represented like wholly liberal values or something, and like Malcolm X represented like leftist values. What I'm saying is that like Martin Luther King made arguments on the basis of liberal values, and other civil rights leaders made arguments on the basis of liberal values. And they made more radical leftist arguments as well. But the arguments that ultimately took hold in public opinion were the liberal values. So the extent is that like the success of the civil rights movement, I think, is really in like its ability to appeal to liberal values. And that's like what people are remembering when they think about the civil rights movements, is those successful appeals. And so like the example that I give sometimes is like the I am the man protest, or I am a man protest, sorry, where people held signs showing that they were like, emphasizing their, common humanity, not their Black identity. And so I think that's an example of an appeal to like a universal humanism, which is common in liberalism. And that was something that really resonated with the public. And that's something that got translated into the Civil Rights Act. So when someone like What a Faultist is saying that he likes the civil rights movement, but doesn't like modern social justice, what he's saying is that he likes these liberal arguments, these appeals to universal humanity, but he doesn't like the prominence in modern day thought of leftist radicalism. Taftash, you don't think radicals co-opted liberal values such that the populace actually remembers the radical actions taken by Cesar Chavez and the farmer strikes, or MLK's political action with BRM Birmingham? I need to like reread this. I'm opening up my Twitter or my YouTube. You don't think that radicals co-opted liberal values? I'm not sure what you mean by co-opted liberal values. I think that radical people, so like I think that like Martin Luther King was in many ways a radical, and he used liberal values as an argument, is what I would say. And I think that like understanding the civil rights movement, you have to understand that there were radical elements and there were liberal elements, but the liberal elements were what ultimately won the day. So I don't think it's like weird to characterize the civil rights movement as one that was like a radical appeal to liberalism. Okay, I mean that liberal values were used as a vehicle to set the grounds for radical action and radical change. Maybe. So I think that's a hard argument to make, that like ultimately they had in mind the sort of goals that like modern social justice movements have. In part because when you read literature on modern social justice beliefs, a lot of times like the explicit formulation of goals that are very radical. For example, like a lot of Ibram X. Kendi's work, the ideas that he's bringing up in regards to anti-racism and redistribution and a focus away from equality and onto equity. These are ideas that simply like they didn't have prominence in the academic literature at the time, and they grew in prominence to the modern day. To the extent that they existed, they were much more like plainly just like they were articulated in much more plainly sort of Marxist terms. So I think the specific like couching of Marxist terms in racialization is something that's very unique and new. Taftash, I don't believe MLK, Malcolm X, or Cesar Chavez would agree with their SJW modern derivatives either. I'm honestly not sure to what extent they would agree or disagree with them. Yeah, I don't know. I think that like requires more delving into literature than I've done. But my argument is just like very simply that like the arguments that were made by these people that were liberal were the ones that ultimately gained prominence. Kendi is anti-Marxist, if anything. I would be very I would not agree with that analysis at all. I think he's not an orthodox Marxist, if that's what you mean. But like you can read his book How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he has like a whole treatise on how capitalism is, evil and racist. Okay, yeah, he's not an orthodox Marxist. I would agree with that. I think that he couches his radical anti-capitalism in racial language. Mhm. How devastating do you think Kennedy's concept of microaggressions is to modern day discourse? I'm not sure. I think that the example that like Ibram X. Kendi gives in his book of microaggressions, or like he gives this example in his book where a black kid was passed over by a teacher and a white kid was called on instead. And maybe it's just like a matter of how he explains it. Um, and maybe like it was more racist than like he actually even lets on in the text, which would be weird if he like left out an instance of, you know, if he left out a quality of the situation that made it seem more racist than it is. The way that he tells the story makes it sound like one day, like a black kid happened to not be called on during class. And this is an example to him of, completely unacceptable racism, which is like pervasive and destructive in our society, that like this happened one time, which, and he specifies that like it's not even like a microaggression, that it's just aggression. And I think it makes him look like crazy. And again, like maybe it's just like a rhetoric thing that like you really poorly explained it, and actually the situation was much worse than he lets on. But like the way that it's written, it looks like something that like is barely of note, that he like dedicates this chapter to discussing. So I think that like really focusing on microaggressions, it teaches people to have this kind of fear of the world, to look for conflict, to look for things that are going to bother them, and to really fixate on those things, which it's an incredibly unhealthy outlook and mentality to engage in. Um, it's sort of like, it's the opposite of what you should do if you want to live a healthy life. Um, is look for these sources of conflict and really fixate on them, and not only fixate on them, but view them as proof that the world is fundamentally against you and that you are powerless to stop it as an individual. That combination of telling people to search for reasons why life is bad and to view themselves as individually powerless is really, I think, very toxic. And this is something that like Jonathan Haidt talks about, modeling of the American mind. But yeah, so I should just continue streaming for a while. Yeah, do you think I should ban this person? Wait, I haven't seen them in the YouTube chat. I have not read papers on concepts, on how his concepts have impacted the business work environment. I know that they've been broadly adopted by like HR departments, which is arguably destructive. And these critiques of individualism sound more like your assessment of D'Angelo. These two people shouldn't be conflated together. What do you mean? What critiques of individualism that I've brought up? I've to be clear, I have not actually read Jonathan Haidt. Streaming for 10 minutes. Hell yeah. I love that. Okay, so to be clear, I think that the obsession with microaggressions and seeking out racism, trying to identify every little thing as racism, is something that causes people to feel powerless. So I would agree that like Kendi is not going to explicitly say that he wants people to feel powerless. I don't think anyone's really going to say that they want people to feel powerless. I think that's the end result of teaching people that the world is systemically stacked against them and that their goal, what they need to do, is seek out and discover these examples of very like minor racism and view them as incredibly destructive, because I think it teaches people to be afraid of their world. Mario inflation is important. I agree. Do you debate on your Discord? I hate typing. Yeah, I could pull you in. If you hop in a voice channel, I'll pull you in a bit. I don't think that I'm going to talk to Stephen more. I don't know. Just get into like my Discord's voice channel. Why no more Stephen? I think it's just sort of awkward to talk to Stephen. And I'm not sure he really enjoys it. But like I didn't even message him last night intending to like hop on a voice call with him. It just sort of happened. Okay, Mr. J.
Hello.
Oh,
Hi. Pleasure to meet you.
yeah, likewise. What's up?
I guess something that I'm trying to figure out right now is sort of um where you're coming from in this like social discourse surrounding like race and gender. Because like on one hand, I sort of see like some of the like just recently, just watching the current discussion with Destiny, I was listening to sort of like this counter argument that you're offering regarding like SJWs and then sort of like the contrast between that and the civil rights movement. And at the same time, then you went on to sort of discuss AGP. And I sort of wanted to talk more about AGP first because I'm really unexperienced with AGP or any of that discourse in general. But sort of the way you're talking about it reminded me a lot about sort of my ideas or sort of my criticisms of like today's discourse surrounding sex, which is like I sort of see it really as like people still trying to deal with like a lot of the conflict going on between secularism and like religion and sort of people having a uncomfortable view with their body and sort of the idea of bodily expression. Um, what are sort of some of your thoughts on that, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, if I can just like get a little bit more clarification, how would you connect like religious discomfort around sex to AGP in the current discourse? What is the connection that you see there?
Um, I I'm trying to take it largely from like the political proponents. So I'm looking at it like from the perspective of like a group of people who aren't just strictly tied to the sexual discourse, but are tied to a whole bunch of other discourses, and sort of seeing like these underlying trends. Like for example, when we have like a group of people who are like progressive or like radical, and to some degree, I would argue that some of these people are like the people I know who are like anti-fascist, who are largely like in disagreement with religion, and as a result, sort of try to take away or try to fight back against any discourse that involves like a certain integration or respect to an idea of like sorry, I'm sorry, I'm super tired. One second.
It's all good. I'm just trying to like parse the connections that you're making.
Yeah, because it just shot through my mind. Okay, let's just start with this. So I think people who the reason why I brought up the religious point was because I feel like there's still this discomfort that like you could largely see in like the sexual revolution movements, not only going on in like America, but like I have pretty good examples of like the post-modernity experience of Korean people, and women in particular who are just finally learning about like the experience of masturbatory action. And I sort of wanted to see like to what degree is this like idea with regards to sexual revolution still being trailed to like this day with regards to like other discourses surrounding like gender and this idea of like AGP and so the religious point I just bring up sort of as a way of like saying like hey like I think there's still some certain discomfort that people have with professing that they, like, to some degree are aroused by their body, because the idea of a fetish in itself is something that's largely, I want to say, carries a lot of like anti-religious sentiment, because a lot of that's sort of the way people have set it up to be, although it strictly isn't that. And like,
When you
that's where I'm
think,
at.
so I think religion is a tool of cultural, like behavioral regulation that people have adopted. And it makes sense in pre-modern and pre-industrial societies to have these sorts of like strictures controlling behavior, but they make a lot less sense in the modern world. So like a big reason why you want people to be very careful around having sex in the pre-modern world is because access to abortion and to contraceptives is much weaker, and getting pregnant is like a very dangerous thing. It poses a lot of issues for the mother, but it also poses issues for society. If people are getting pregnant very easily and actually carrying those children to term successfully, the end result of that is having children that are going to affect the social stability of a world. And I think that, when you have the sexual revolution, really it's like in many ways it's a reaction to changing technology, and changing social standards. Having access to contraception and abortion, it forces people to reevaluate their opinions on sexuality, because now sexuality is something that you can engage with more frivolously with less consequences. And so that ability, that technological connection, forced a kind of reevaluation. I think something similar is happening with sexual fetishes and, for example, transgenderism. In the past, the ability to actually transition successfully was something that was very limited. So like you could cross-dress, and maybe you could like drink like a pregnant mare's piss to like get estrogen in like the ancient world. And some people were able to do that, but like people today don't know how HRT works and are never going to access it. And, going back further, the ability to actually like hormonally transition in a way, without like modern pharmaceuticals is severely limited. And so like people didn't really have to contend with the existence of trans people, because trans people were in many ways like incredibly invisible and didn't really have a way to transition socially. And so I think that like the changing technology has forced people to recontend with what fetishes mean and like what role they should have in influencing your life. If a fetish like can't actually be realized, right? Like you can't make yourself a furry werewolf, then you don't really need to contend with like the moral implications of making yourself a furry werewolf. But if we were able to like come out tomorrow with technology that turned people into werewolves, there'd be like a lot of, quite intense moral discussions about the validity of doing so. So I think I see a lot of these things as connected inherently to technological progress as well.
Do you think, okay, because this is something that's, so I see how you focus sort of like on the line of religion with regards to the individualistic lens, where we're looking mainly like at the safety of a person in terms of like the consequences of having sex. And
Mhm.
I think that's a very important lens. But at the same time, I have to ask, like, to what degree do you think the communal element that religion plays in the discourse of sex motivates some of this, like this individualistic drive or this action that we're talking about? So, like, what I'm trying to get at is like, we've certainly like had like a lot of people who are transgender to some degree, like go throughout like history, and but at the same time, I could sort of see how these people wouldn't necessarily consider themselves transgender because they were actually part of an evolving discourse with regards to like spiritualistic or elements, like Native Americans, for example, or indigenous people rather, who were interested in the idea of sort of becoming their gods and so forth. And um, I don't, I guess like what I'm trying to really drive at here is sort of like in today's discussion regarding like fetishisms and like kinks and so forth, like how much of this is really just a discussion about like a person sort of dealing with like this individualistic religious line that you drew, and as opposed to the communal one that I'm trying to draw, where like people are trying to find a sense of like community or engage with a new network that's motivated by the creation of the internet, in such a way as to like find more, I guess, love in themselves, because I feel like there's not that much of that. I feel like there's like a certain reaction that like the sexual revolution is carrying forward that people are still trying to deal with, which is this sort of aversion to religion and not really taking the communalistic elements that religion offered, such as like the safety of the family and to some degree the critiques of the family, like the nuclear family, for example, and like friendship, I guess, and other elements like that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. A lot of people end up identifying as queer in some way just because they're looking for community. Like there's recent data that's been released on the relative frequency of queer identity in different generations. But if you look at the number of people within that group who actually identify as like having like same-sex attraction, it's very low. That number actually has not like changed that much. And so the queer community, like the boundaries of what is considered queer behavior, has expanded enormously. And I would absolutely buy the idea that like a big part of that is people just looking for a community and looking for ways to fit in with each other.
So I guess something that I'm also trying to figure out here, because you brought up this idea of like this expansion of the boundaries of what is queer, and like something I've been looking at is like Maggie Nelson like talks about in her book The Argonaut, sort of about this act of pregnancy, and sort of she uses pregnancy sort of as like a metaphor, or I'm still trying to figure this out, but rather, or something truthful maybe, as like in comparison to how the queer the activities that like we consider largely queer exist within like all of us to some extent. The difference being that like we don't realize they're queer until we're a part of that community, or we have humans who sort of espouse certain reactions. Like you showed up to Destiny's stream talking about the idea of status. And I think status is like a very interesting metric by which we can gauge the community interaction, or the determinacy of like an activity as queer. Like when a woman is treated as pregnant, for example, as opposed to a woman who's not, and they go throughout like their daily lives, they may have certain expressions that people may give to them that are different from as if they were not pregnant, like looks, like gentleness, like kindness, and so forth. And that could be considered largely queer in the sense that like it's very much atypical from the daily activities that people would normally associate with like themselves. And I guess something I have to ask is like, where do you think like this, if we have the tools to like recognize to some degree like something like status, and sort of how like things like queer can expand to encompass new activities, like where do you think it's heading, and to like what degree do you think that like what problems do you think we have to wrestle with? Because one problem I really think we need to focus on right now is trying to find what is it about religion that helped to build like really great communities, and trying to use that to some extent to build even better and even stronger like queer communities.
I think it's heading towards gender abolition. So I think when you see like the expansion of queer identities, a lot of it happens around transgender identification, and more specifically, like people who are increasingly identifying as non-binary or gender fluid. Basically, what they're doing is they're rejecting sort of the societal prescriptions for their gender identity, and instead taking on these new, more like amorphous gender identities. And I think it's really that's like a very political and philosophical sort of position to take, more so than one that's rooted in your actual brain chemistry or biology. So I think that like when you see people identifying more with these like alternative gender identities, what that's communicating is not necessarily I have dysphoria. What it's communicating is like I have a specific opinion about the way that gender should work. And I've joined a group that is like broadly aligned with my interests. And this is why like you have things like political transness or political blackness, where people will say things like, you know, you don't really represent trans people. You aren't really trans, you know, if you aren't towing this party line. And this is something that I experience where like, if I bring up my political opinions with trans people, I will get, you know, responses, people saying that like, okay, I want to like genocide trans people. I want like the destruction of trans people. I'm not like welcome in the community and whatnot. And I think it really speaks to the fact that like queer identity has become more and more like a political expression than a biological expression. And that, you know, it goes back to what you're talking about people's search for community and using transness or race or whatever as a proxy for that.
So, to what degree do you think like this is sort of like a de-evolution then, like back into sort of like this tribalistic attitude that like people are trying to, I guess, do, which is like it's no longer necessarily a pursuit in truth, but rather like a pursuit in sort of you know what people in my local area or how I am treated. Like I guess what I'm trying to get at is like how do you wrestle with that problem of sort of this like interaction between like you know what we want to consider like something as like general, something like that is empirically to some degree like validated, as opposed to something that is socially validated when it comes to like transgenderism.
We wrestle with it.
Yeah, like I could give you, so like hypothetically speaking, like so let's say we have like a village of some sorts, just comprised of a multiplicity of like white people and like Spanish people and Korean people. And they all come to say like to some degree they all come to say like to some degree like we are black. And the reason why they say like we are black is because they engage heavily with like black media and like black culture, and they embrace like the African American vernacular with regards to like LA or something like that. And then like sort of when they have to go into outside of their village or outside of their city into another city, and they go on to say like yeah, to some degree like they say like I'm black to a person who is legitimately black and has experienced like the history of what it means and what it is to be black. um like how do you like the problem obviously emerges there, right? Where like we see someone who's like socially validated to some degree within their own community, but once they go outside that world into another, they're immediately at odds or at conflict.
Yeah. So like the problem here is that like Black identity is something that is tied to real things in the real world. It's basically, it's not a frivolous identity. So like if you were to say like, oh, I'm a flumpus, right? And you've got a community of people who identify as flumpuses. And that person like goes out into the world and says, I'm a flumpus, right? They're not going to like disagree with that person immediately because it basically has like no bearing on anything. It's like a word without meaning. But like Black identity is something that's been set up in like the cultural milieu as something that entitles you to certain like privileges, right? And like one of those privileges is like access to affirmative action or equity policies. And so like a lot of our social justice infrastructure is built up on the idea that like Black identity should be something that is like specially recognized and which offers special things. Another thing would be like, you know, like saying the N word, right? And this kind of like something that seems frivolous or ridiculous, but like the idea that like culturally we expect that one group of people is allowed to say this word and other groups aren't. When you say something like, oh, I identify as Black and you are, you know, you look like me, people basically view that as like a claim to privilege to like say the N-word and to access like special rights which ameliorate past injustices. And so I think that's like really why people are upset about it. In the same way that like if you identify as a woman, as like a trans woman, and you tell that to people, a lot of times the criticism is that like what you're doing is you're claiming access to certain areas that they don't believe you should have access to. So like women's sports, the reason why that blew up is because like, and why that is like such an integral part of people arguing against trans identity is because they see that as like your identity is your way of like laying claim to something in the real world. And so I think that like that's really why you have these like big sticking points.
So the weird part for me, though, especially with regards to like the sports discourse surrounding like a lot of like transgender people, is that I feel like a lot of people who are progressive, who are radical, what they are doing, especially like in the hypothetical that you brought up with the flumps and so forth, is they're trying to push for a universal expression of the concept. And like what I mean by this is like we're not necessarily, when we talk about transgender people in sports, we're not necessarily talking about empirically validated transgender people. What we're actually talking about is something beyond that, which is the heteronormativity of our society. We're trying to make it so that like when we gauge people in sports, it's no longer something that like a woman's sports or like a men's sports, but rather it's people who are based solely on their characteristics as like a person and their biological sort of like body measurements and their strengths. But we don't need to call it men's or women's sports, and we don't need to use that type of terminology anymore, because to some degree we are all like sort of participants, and we're sort of all engaging within like within sports, and to limit like our expression or sort of our actions to what is confined to like a men's sports or like a woman's sports isn't like a true expression of who we are. Like I don't know if that makes sense, but that's sort of like something that I keep on seeing a lot, is sort of this push to like this universalization of sort of what it means not to be transgender, but to sort of be trans, and to some extent in the sense that like a lot of people want to say like, hey, like we're bi, like hey, like we're all bi, like there's no such thing as like someone who's like purely straight or someone who's like purely gay, and as a result like we come to express ourselves in ways that extend beyond just masculinity but femininity as well. And there's sort of like things like that that I see are going on. And so like maybe to drag it back for the audience, in the hypothetical with the village or the city of Koreans and Mexicans and so forth who come to the black neighborhood to then say like they're black because they engage with like black culture and they engage with the African American vernacular, what they're doing here is they're attempting to say like, hey, to some degree, like I recognize I may not have been in your shoes, but I recognize your struggles and I am sympathetic with it. And to some degree, I want to be a part of it in the sense that I want to help you. And so that's why I choose to sort of like embrace a lot of these like activities. Like it's really fun and it's really enjoyable. I love listening to rap. I love sort of speaking this language, been growing up with it. So like, why can't I call myself black? Like that's sort of like where I feel like it goes.
Right.
If I be honest.
And I think that like what people will acknowledge is that race is a social construct. I think most people, except for like race realists, basically agree that race is a social construct. And so the question then is like, why can't you just identify between races? And I think you also have this like with gender, where people will say like gender is a social construct. But at the same time, we write policy based on sex and based on an assumption that gender broadly correlates with sex and with like medical transition. So like one example of this would be prisons. The policy that trans women shouldn't be housed in male prisons is based on an assumption that trans women do something to their biology, that there's something biologically different about trans women in their brain that causes them like a need to change their sex that makes it then unsafe for them to be in male prisons. If it were true that like sex had no bearing on your physicality, then it wouldn't actually matter. You wouldn't actually need these policies. It wouldn't actually be like necessary to house trans women in a men's or women's prison, because you would have no reason to suspect that trans men might fall into certain biological categories that makes them unsuited for being in male prisons. And so I think that like a similar thing is happening with race, where like people agree that like race is a social construct, but at the same time we've built like policies around race that like actually do affect people based on skin color. And so in the past, those policies were like redlining, where Black people were explicitly, prohibited from getting house loans in areas, getting access to that kind of capital. And so people look at those like explicit, like racially discriminatory policies. And now we have racially discriminatory policies. The only racially discriminatory policies that are on the books are things like Biden's plan to give Black farmers and farmers of various ethnicities that aren't white special entitlements, right? And so like the reason why we don't want, or why progressives don't want people just like willy-nilly identifying between races, is because it makes their political project of ameliorating past wrongs completely untenable. If we allow people to just like identify however they want, you can no longer craft policy to target like past injustices.
Yeah. So
And I would say that like Black identity, just for like chatters who I think are a little bit confused, is not like, it's not like this plainly like power politics like goal of getting entitlements. That's like not what Black identity is in like a broad sense. But like the reason ultimately why you can't just like, or why someone like Kimberly Crenshaw would say that like it's not good to let people just identify willy-nilly, is ultimately because they're trying to create this political project around entitling people to certain things based on Black identity. And so like Black identity has existed before entitlements, but I would also say that like the reason why Black identity, became something in the first place is because people had entitlements for white people. So when you have like scientific racism getting started in Europe, and people are arguing that white people have like special right to rule over or enslave Black people because of this or that thing, right? Those entitlements are what ultimately solidified our modern conceptions of race. And if you go back further, like before pre-modern times, people don't talk about race in the same way. Like there isn't a Black identity. If you go to Africa, right, like people in Africa are not wholly united around being Black. This is an American concept, and it's an American concept that arises because of our unique history with race. So if you go to, Africa and you look at like, if you look at Rwanda and the racial conflict within Rwanda between different groups of Black people, these are not people who are like united around Black identity in the way that we have it in the United States. They're united around tribal identities. And the reason why they're united around tribal identities is because people make the argument that because of this tribal identity or that tribal identity, they're entitled to special rules and power.
Yeah, you said a lot there, so I'm gonna try and do this. I think something that we need to start with recognizing when we talk about the ability for us to perceive the limits to which someone can willy-nilly change their identity, and how that impacts political policy, is sort of seeing the different political projects that people are a part of and how they gauge their metrics for like things such as time. So like for the person who sort of perceives the fact that they can like change their identity to some degree in a radical shift, I think the way they're thinking about things with regards to time is has less to do with certain political modifications of like the present, with like policy and so forth, but has something more to do with intimate expressions of the community that they're already a part of. And like when we have to fight between this type of person and the other person who's sort of looking for this strict and to some degree safe and we know useful expression because it allows us not to just engage within our own community but other communities, we have to then like figure out where does it go awry. So like an example I could give you is like with what's going on in Africa right now and the discourse surrounding Pan-Africanism and other movements that disagree with Pan-Africanism, where they're saying we shouldn't largely attribute the history of African people as something that is united, as you correctly pointed out, and to some and as opposed to that of like a tribalistic nature where people have their distinct, unique identities. And so there's sort of like this conflict going on here because on one hand, the reason why people want that universal expression is because they want to use it as a way of being critical of certain concepts, such as that of slavery. And it allows us to further like articulate the history of Africa as a whole, because then when we come to be critical of Eurocentric perceptions of Africa, we could sort of bring on these ideas. Whereas like other people, the reason as to why they disagree with that this conception is because they don't want people to generalize them to the point where they feel like they lose the substance of their own communities.
I think that's
I feel
right.
like,
Yeah. Well, just like very quickly hit on this.
yes.
Like, there's a lot of tensions within Africa. Africa's giant and very diverse, and like not every group of people gets along with each other. And so I think like this universalism, I think people feel that it like papers over those tensions and sort of pretends they don't exist. But yeah, continue.
The biggest thing for me right now is trying to figure out like with these two, because these are like the two gauging acts, like these are the two different acts of expression that I see like are always competing with each other, and always fighting. The one who's trying to universalize as opposed to the one who's trying to be true and accessible and unique in the sense that they are specific as to who they are. I don't know to how we resolve that junction, and I don't think it should be resolved. I think if anything, what should be going on is sort of like what I feel like is an embracement of sort of this struggle between these two different movements, in the sense that we could recognize to some degree the reasons as to why this conflict emerges between these two different groups has sort of something to do with their articulations on sort of different, because they're trying to correct different problems because they're working at different levels. And so I don't know if it would be safe to resolve that junction. And that's sort of why I'm hesitant to even like accept sort of this idea that like, well, it's sort of bad for people to willy-nilly like change their gender to some extent, when at the same time it's acceptable and it's healthy within their community, because I feel like their community is inevitably still going to be affected by the types of changes that you want, which are politically active ones that create policy. And so, if anything, the community might change as a result of that creation of policy. So, I don't necessarily, I guess what I'm trying to say is not that like I wouldn't be critical, but rather that I would try to gauge to what degree this community is working and to what degree is that outcome really effective for their own goals within their own framework. Because if we can't understand their frameworks, how are we ever to like create policy that could sort of meet and mediate the variety of communities that exist today?
Yeah, I think that's right. And like when you look at a lot of Black communities in the United States that are really struggling, I think you have to recognize that like something is going awry here, and the status quo is like not, if you just like continue the status quo, things are not going to be good for people. And so I think that like both universalism and a kind of like race distinction argument made by like these extreme progressives, they're both like sort of reaching for the same thing, which is trying to change things and improve things for people. but they're definitely doing it in very different ways. And so I think that like the people who really want to maintain like strict boundaries on blackness, so people who say things that like, you know, you're not really black if you don't hold certain political views. It's like a very strict sort of boundary on blackness that excludes a lot of people with dark skin. And so, but that boundary, like the reason why it's being established is because someone is trying to advance certain political goals and rally people around them. And those goals are probably to like, you know, get certain ameliorations for past injustices. That would be the goal, right? And the reason, or like the strategy to do it is by like rallying around a certain identity. And I think people on the other side are saying that like by trying to seek out these governmental solutions, they're ignoring problems within the communities that are contributing to the suffering. So like there's this paper that came out of the University of Chicago on consumption, material consumption between racial groups. And it found that something like 50% of the wealth gap between Black and white families could be ameliorated, could be removed if consumption habits were equalized, right? So when you accounted for a consumption, 50% of that gap disappeared. And so I think that people who are reaching for a sort of, you know, universalism, who are not like advocating for this kind of like redistribution around racial lines, they're saying that like, well, when we focus on redistribution, we sort of lose access or we lose like perspective on other problems within the community. And I think that like, but like ultimately both of these groups want people to be successful and happy, and both probably have like some element of truth within them that they're reaching for.
Yeah, so like I guess I want to put some hard examples out so that way like the audience can follow along. So like one thing I'm thinking of is like sort of the discussion around like people who well, we can use BLM for example. So like to some degree like BLM like, well, with regards to like how they've set themselves up online and how they've went to become politically active. Although I wouldn't say the online website is necessarily comparable to that of the people who are out there on the streets to some degree. But for now, like we'll sort of deal with as it is. Like one idea is sort of like the abolition, or to some degree, not the full-on abolition, but rather a huge defunding of the police. And on the other hand, we sort of see other people who are gauging with BLM sort of motivations to defund the police by asking like, to what degree will this like do us good? Because we, to some degree, Black people themselves are saying like, well, we still need the police to help us defend just in case like, you know, something goes on. That's obviously a problem. And I don't know, like when I hear solutions like community policing, as sort of like an alternative to people who say like defund the police. I guess like the biggest question I have to ask is like, to what degree do you actually know that your community like would want this type of policing? And because to me it feels like there's a huge like I don't know, like there's like people just are ignorant rather of like their surroundings when they go on these political like tirades, and I don't know where people take like the institution of BLM to be something that's like seriously advocating for things like the George Floyd bill, as opposed to like things that are very like fundamental to like their diatribe that they had on their website that talked about like how they wish to like abolish certain concepts or certain ways in which the police were instructed, and went on to be critical of capitalism and talking about like the failures of capitalism with regards to like how Black people are treated and so forth. Like there's a lot of like baggage that goes on in these movements, and I don't know how people can juggle with those things when they like try to push. I'm characterizing BLM as this universal expression, and like I'm characterizing like the people who are within these communities as sort of these individual participants who have to react. And I don't know to what degree there are really safe reactions that BLM can offer to a lot of these people within their communities, because BLM just has so much to it. It's carrying so much weight because it's trying to do so many different things. And I think that's a problem, and it's a result of its universalism, because it's trying to not just be critical of how people are treated by the police, but being critical of something that's an extension of the police, like the military-industrial complex, or like shit like that, the state-industrial complexes and capitalism and shit, and like it spirals out of control. And I don't know where it stops, to some degree. And I guess that's sort of like my question to you is like how do why do like these movements or these people who sort of like, if you could get in their minds, what do you think sort of like is the strategy there for like creating these movements that are packed in with so many different sentiments, so many different ideas that sometimes contradict when being presented? Like how do they expect participants, or rather people who are having to receive this information within their own communities and seeing these changes, how do they expect them to like deal with them in a safe and like helpful way?
I mean, I think the problem with like the ultimate boundary expanding policy or philosophy is that when you expand boundaries too far, the term ceases to have any meaning, or the group ceases to have any meaning. So like you have this with trans people, where like if anyone can be trans for any reason, the word ceases to have any use. And this is like why gatekeeping has use, and like why groups try to maintain some sort of ideological consistency. Because if being trans, for example, like doesn't require you to have dysphoria, then there's very little you can say about the actual shared experiences of trans people. And I think too that like if you say that like being Black is just like a matter of identity and doesn't correlate to anything else, then there's like very little that you can say about the needs of Black people. And so when you say that like Black people is like this group who have this like specific skin color and that correlates to certain experiences, then I think that's how you get sort of arguments for, well, okay, now that we know this group has this certain experience, we can target policy towards them. So I think that like, I'm not sure that I would characterize BLM as like this universalizing movement, because I think if anything, BLM is a group that's like very focused on sort of defining boundaries around what it means to be Black. And I think that like on the other side of that is people who are saying that like ultimately like race shouldn't matter at all, and we ought to do away with these boundaries and really make like a cultural effort to not consider people by their skin color in policy or in hiring or in anything else. And they would say that like the focus by groups like BLM on race further embeds these sort of racial distinctions. It teaches people to view white people or Black people as tribal identities that are, you know, poised against each other. And when you see like literature that sees white people as like a class that uses whiteness as capital to hold people down, I think that's the kind of like tribalistic identity that universalism is like trying to break.
Oh, okay, that's interesting, because I would say the opposite. I feel like that's the tribalistic identity that like universalism is like in BLM, which I conceive is sort of a universal expression of that very thing that you just classified, which is sort of this relationship between race and capital and this criticism that's embedded within it. I feel like BLM is trying to push to express that, and to universalize that, to say that this is sort of distinct within like Black people and so forth. Like that's interesting, because that's sort of the way that's sort of, yeah. I guess like one thing I'd have to think about then is like if you say that that's sort of like if you say that this relation is something that's like I feel like we're going at it at different points. Then I have to figure out how to bring them back.
Yeah, maybe. Because like the way that I see universalism in regards to like we'll do trans stuff and race stuff, is that like
Okay.
universalism with trans stuff is sort of, or queer stuff, is saying that we're all sort of like same, like there's no real like underlying distinction between people. You can like identify as trans if you want to, and like being trans includes, it's like a very big tent and includes all sorts of people with very different experiences. That's how I would define universalism within trans stuff, is like this big tent thing. And then I would say that like with race, universalism, the universalist position would be saying that like, you know, anyone ought to like sort of identify as whatever, and like we have these like very big tents for racial groups, or even for like erasing those racial distinctions at all and saying we're all just sort of part of the human race. And then like the more particularist version of this would be to say that like, well, there are actually distinct boundaries on what makes someone black or white. And so when you see someone who says something that like blackness is not just like your skin color, it's like your skin color and like a specific way that you relate to the world. So like being conservative would be like a form of whiteness, or, you know, not being like with the political movement is like a form of whiteness. I think that's like placing a very specific boundary on what it means to be black and sort of like gatekeeping people out of it rather than trying to include everyone in it.
So I agree with the first one regarding transgenderism and it's sort of that universal expression. For now, I think. Now with the one with race, I feel like we need to, because I feel like on one hand we're talking about universal expression of sort of race, but on the other hand we're talking about a political expression that's attempting to be universalized with regards to race, and that sort of, so like when I hear people who are attempting to talk about things like transracialism and sort of these ideas where you could, you know, we could be like who we be, if you're white, well, you could be black to some extent. That like I feel like there's a certain that has less to do with sort of an adherence to race, but rather an adherence to like ideas with regards to like transhumanism or extensions of concepts and identities that go beyond our current understanding of how social structures and social concepts work. And what I mean by this is like there's an attempt to like say like, yes, you're absolutely right that when we talk about social concepts such as race and gender, they are trying to map onto things that are very real. However, we could take that a step further and say just because they map onto those things that are very real doesn't mean that we're strictly bound to them, but rather we can evolve in such a way as to still adhere to them and preserve these elements, but at the same time create wider expression for them. And that's sort of like where the discourse is at right now, I think, like with people who believe these sort of ideas. And I think that's kind of healthy to some degree, but at the same time, I'm sort of like trying to figure out if this is really like a good, like if consequentially speaking, that is a good outcome considering the current discourse and this idea of these universal expressions. Because on the other hand, when we look at these particularities that come out, that as you within your given definition, where they like create this tribalism to some degree because they're trying to set certain boundaries for saying someone is white because they're talking about conservatism and in support of it. I don't think those people are strictly adhering to race when they say those things at all. I think what they're really talking about is they're looking at as sort of a post-colonial tradition of criticizing certain historical reactions to activities, political activities that disfavored black people, such as people who were in discomfort with the abolition of slavery during the antebellum era, and the concept of whiteness sort of emerges there to some extent. And I don't know, like, because to me that particular example sounds more to me like less to do with race, but rather like an attempt at expressing a certain political sentiment about race.
Yeah, I agree. What I would say is that like race as a category is something that was created for political purposes and is perpetrated for political purposes. So like I would argue that when you look at like the modern conception of race, it's something that like arose because people wanted to justify certain policies like slavery, right?
Mhm.
And so I think that when people want to perpetrate race as a social concept, what they're really doing is they're trying to achieve some sort of political end. Um, and I think that like that end could be like a white ethno-state, or it could be an end like reparations, right? So like
Mhm.
having clear, distinct racial categories is necessary if you want something like reparations. If you don't have like a distinct understanding of what a Black person is, you can't, tax people and give a Black person money.
Mhm.
And so I think that when people like try to have these specific boundaries, like they're doing it for a political reason, and maybe that political reason is noble, maybe it's not noble, but I think the ultimate end result of having like categories of race is not a good one. I think that when you look at like racial categories as a social construct, their end result has been over and over just incredibly destructive.
Okay.
And so I think that like your very first example of like a group of community, a community of people who like identify as Black because they connect a lot with like Black music or Black culture or foods that are associated with Black people and so on. I think that like it's not good if people are like kept out of participating in engaging with like a culture because of their race. And that goes like, whichever way. And this is like, it's very much like an Americanism of me. But like, one thing that I love about America is like the ability of different racial groups and ethnicities to engage with each other's cultures. I think that's a really beautiful thing. And it's resulted in a lot of interesting like American inventions. Like like Irish, like St. Patrick's Day is like this blending of Irish culture and American culture. And it's
Yeah.
interesting and it's cool. And like Chinese food in America is like a blending of American and Chinese traditions. And it creates something interesting and unique and flavorful. And so I think that like the ability of different ethnicities to like work with each other and share things and contribute to something like some sort of meaningful sharing is something that I really like about America. And I think that like having these hard boundaries on like, well, this is like something for Black people. And if you are white, you're not allowed to like engage with it. Otherwise, it's cultural appropriation or whatever. I think is like, it's a very low level of toxicity where like the end result of that is like, it's not super harmful, but like the collective total of putting these like distinct racial categories out there in the world and socially enforcing them has been and continues to be like not so good for people.
I think because I don't know to like what degree us sort of decrying or us sort of like with regards to like cultural appropriation.
Okay, wait, can I first like respond to this like chatter?
Yes, go right ahead.
Big Smoke says like Chinese food in America isn't authentic Chinese food. But like this is the exact point that I'm making is that like Chinese people came to America and then blended like their preferences for food with the available like resources that they had and therefore created something interesting and unique, right? And like that's what I'm exactly saying is that like this blend of cultures is what's very interesting and valuable. But yeah, continue.
Yeah, absolutely. The fusion of cultural elements, I think is something that's interesting discussion because on one hand, like I feel like when we talk about the idea of cultural appropriation, what's being attempted to some degree is to, um, I feel like to moderate that fusion, and I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing because I think when I say moderate, like I'm thinking of examples where we have like a white woman who's like wearing a Chinese dress, for example. Um, and people just get really mad because like she shouldn't be wearing that because like she's not Chinese. Like
Yeah,
for me, I
Trump
don't know
suit.
if that's a healthy, yeah, Trump suit, I believe. I don't know if that's a healthy example of like cultural appropriation, but I feel like I could point to like examples that are healthy in the sense that like there's certain people who are blatantly with utter like disregard to a culture attempting to manufacture money off it. Like, I don't know, I could point to examples where like we have like these really cheap things that like pretend to be said that they're made from like Mexico or something like that, but in reality they're like made from China. And like, I don't know if that, I feel like that type of production is something that could be like critical, we could be critical of. Or even examples where like we have a white guy who's pretending that neighborhood that was predominantly like black people, and he's talking about his experience like with that, and like he never actually was born there, never was actually raised there, and so like it's all a mishmash of lies. Like, I feel like in this case like cultural appropriation would be like a good thing, because here we like see like someone who to some degree is attempting to commodify certain elements. Commodifying thing isn't inherently bad, but like when it happens with regards to like a blatant disregard to culture, I feel like it becomes a problem. I feel like that'd be a safe form of critique.
Yeah, I agree. And so I think that like we have to acknowledge there are instances where like cultural appropriation is actually cultural erasure. And so
Mhm.
if, for example, like this happened a lot with native and indigenous cultures, where like white people would come in and by like taking on cultural expressions of indigenous people, integrating them, and then like reinforcing their view of how the culture should operate back on them, it resulted in like cultural disintegration. And so I think that's like an example of something that's like not so good. But ultimately, like the reason why it's not so good is not because like a culture was like taken on and adopted by another culture, but because like how it was taken on and adopted was like reinforced on the original group as like the correct way to do things. So I mean, like it's interesting, like with the Chinese dress and like the cheongsam and whatnot, is because like that like style of dress was something that like only existed because Chinese culture or like groups within Beijing and Shanghai, these like big Chinese cities, adopted Western style of dress and like adapted it
Wow.
to like this fusion with their culture. So the fact that like now it's sort of been like re-seen or like reintegrated as something that's like viewed as authentically Chinese is kind of it's kind of ironic in a way.
Absolutely, absolutely. I feel like something I really sort of want to discuss with you now is sort of like this idea of people, of like when it comes to race, especially like, and our relationship to something like maybe Japanese culture, for example, in America. Um, like, I feel like there's a certain problem that like people are avoiding discussing. And what I mean by this is like, when we look at like the hard production process that goes into making an anime, and then we go on to like hear about like the stories that like go on within Japanese workers or painters and artists within their own society, um, and how difficult it is for them to like labor and to get those to get like the proper food and nutrition, and the high suicidality and so forth. Like, yet like we're still fascinated by Japanese culture. We're still fascinated by the idea of Japanese people, and I feel like there's some weird problem that's going on there where like people are justifying their sort of fascination with certain races, and not really seeing the consequences of a lot of their actions, such as like this huge buying and purchasing of anime and Japanese production commodities, but not really like, I don't know if we're giving our due credit, if I may say. Like, I feel
Mhm.
like what we're doing goes beyond just being a simple customer who buys something from a store. Like, we're not just being a simple customer who buys something from a store. We're being the guy who like the store is literally like living in an island on that like we practically own. And the moment like we say one thing or do another thing, the store drastically like differs in shape and size, and like the people inside it like are going on like a roller coaster ride because they don't know what the fuck's going on, because I feel like a lot of times they don't really have a lot of control or understanding about the influences that America has on their work and on their ideas. And I don't know to what degree like really like race comes in the sense that like individually, but like I feel like there's a certain the race and capital line that like BLM and other movements try to go across speaks a lot to sort of a lot of these actions, and I feel like we need to sort of discuss it more. I don't know if that made sense. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
So like your point is that when you have cultures interacting and one culture consumes a lot of cultural output of another culture, it can like sort of warp the production of the item for the people back at home. So like maybe an example of this would be like modern movies when they're produced very much are produced with the like Chinese audience in mind. And so like you won't have like a big gay relationship in a Star Wars film that like has any real prominence because they want to be able to edit that out overseas when it's exported to like Russia or the Middle East or China. They want to have that option. And so like even though American culture is very queer friendly, that won't necessarily get translated into all of media. And maybe what you're saying is that that in a way is like a betrayal of authentic American culture, which is broadly queer friendly, in favor of kind of appealing to this universalism being able to fit everywhere. And so in that, like an authentic expression of local culture is lost. Is that?
Absolutely, yeah. The cultural odor that a commodity, such as an American commodity like the movie, loses that smell the moment it goes across to another country because the smell is dissatisfied or doesn't properly fit within the respective culture it's engaging with.
And so what I would say is that like that is okay. It's okay if Marvel movies like do not strive to like really authentically represent American culture because there are movies who do that. And there are movies who like authentically represent queer culture. And it's okay, I think, that like if some movies try to reach this kind of universalism, because there will continue to be like a market for movies that don't do that, as long as like American culture is very powerful. And so maybe like to get more specific, the problems are really highlighted when you have a culture that's like very weak economically
Yes.
or politically. So like
Yes.
indigenous cultures would be a good example of this. And then I think you have to like ask this question of like, is it inherently good to preserve cultures like perpetually? Is that like an end unto itself that is worth pursuing?
I think, okay, so I can give you an example. So sushi, when brought to America, we'll start with sushi. It was largely considered, I believe, like a food for the peasantry within Japan. When it brought to America, it became like a super high life sort of entree for a lot of people. And that radical shift in sushi not only affected like people in America, but affected people in Japan as well, to the point where it became like normalized as an entry, sort of not only for normal people, but for the high life as well. And this sort of reaction, I think, is certainly healthy to some extent. But I think the problem emerges when our country, like America, gives back, not just in the form of cash, but in the form of cultural interest to a predominantly weaker country like Japan. And that cultural interest is something that like we want to call like soft power to some extent, right? This is the political power that cultural influence, such as the country of Japan, has on the social or the political changes and reactions that a country like America experiences. And this to me, I think, is like an interesting political tool that needs more discussion, because I feel like certain problems in Japan can be well explained through this line where we see America feeding off the anime industry. Yet at the same time, we see as a result of this, anime workers becoming more and more and more and more overworked to the point where they're not receiving proper rights and not receiving proper nutrition, and their lives are like miserable. And a big product of this for people who want to extrapolate would be like, oh well, this is American consumerism at its finest. Like here we see like the output in the sense not only to like the buyer but to the producer, where like the buyer is less and less and less concerned with thinking about the consequences of the things that they purchase, and more concerned with the experience of the act of consuming that thing that they purchase, which to some degree is okay, but it spirals out of control when the producer is affected by that sort of negligence and has to sort of bear the weight of these problems.
Yeah, I think that like here we'd probably get into a discussion broadly about like markets and whether or not markets are moral and the degree to which they're coercive, which I think is maybe a whole other discussion. But I've got to run for now. Thank you so much for talking. It was a lot of fun. I appreciate the back and forth. So yeah, I'm gonna head out, guys. It was lovely, but Mr. J, thank you so much for chatting and making stream an interesting thing to do for the past, few hours or so.
Yep, no problem. I appreciate the discussion. Have a wonderful day. Can I DM you a chance? Because I may have some more questions.
Yeah, I'm gonna add you as a friend.
Okay, cool. SpaghettiOs. Also, I'm not a communist. Whoever keeps on saying that. Bye.
All right. Bye, guys. I love you all. You guys are